Another statement that the Impressionists will make is that the English didn't educate the Indian population much, and to the extent they did, well, I'll let Tharoor present the basic argument here.
You take language, for example. The British had no intention of imparting education to the masses of Indians and made it very clear they weren't going to spend the money doing that. And indeed, as late as 1930, the American historian Will Durant observed that the entire budget of the British for education in India, from the nursery level to the highest university levels, amounted to less than half the high school budget of the state of New York. And that was for the entire country of India, with, at that point, 10 times as many people as the state of New York. The fact is that the British were not interested in investing in education, and even the English language was brought in just to educate a narrow class of sort of interpreters between the governors and the governed, people who would help the British by constituting a buffer between them and the dirty masses whom they ruled. I mean, that was very much the attitude. Macaulay actually said this in his notorious minute on education in India, where he said that we need to create a class of Indians, Indian in skin and color, but English in opinions and tastes and morals and in intellect. That was those were his exact words. And it was to serve their purposes.
I decided to just look this up to see if this was actually true. And guess what, guys? This is literally not true. In terms of how education funds were spent in India, it was over 90% on primary schooling. The goal was to educate the masses, if we to our infer motive from what the money was actually being spent on. It was actually being spent on primary schooling. Literally the exact opposite of what Tharoor here said. Now, in terms of total spending, it's important to see the actual data. Yes, India, a smaller proportion of government spending was spent on schools than was in the princely states which had more autonomy within the Raj. But the proportion of government spending spent on education wasn't much lower than Western European countries outside of the UK. And consider the results. Literacy in India went from around 3.25% in 1872 to around 17.88% in 1948. So a 5.5-fold increase. Admittedly in 76 years, but hey, what was the rate of increased literacy before British administration? It was none, it was flat. It was flat, probably somewhere around 3% going back to the BCs. And if one points out the higher education spending in the princely states, fair enough, but keep in mind that the princely states were still within the Raj, and the princely states weren't spending that much on education before the Raj, before the English took over. Now, we can always criticize and say maybe the English should have spent more on education, and I would agree. I think more money should have been spent on education than was. I think the amount was too low. But these breathless condemnations, or the claim that the British only funded higher level education because they wanted to create an administrative buffer out of the Indian elite educated in English ways, well, their actions don't point to this at all. Their actions point to an intent to engage in mass education and to improve literacy, and they actually had some significant results in that direction. The English presided over regular annual improvements in literacy year over year, and they managed this result despite the population increasing almost 63% from 1871 to 1948. And this little glib line about the high school budget in New York being greater than that of India, what is this supposed to mean? Is it the duty of the English to match that? To spend that much per person on a population that was anywhere from 240 to 390 million, depending on the year? Was it the duty of the English to bankrupt their entire economy in order to spend that much on every Indian child? And when Indians had more and more and more and more children, we had another 10 million children this year, pay up, English. Is that the requirement now? Also, the fact that labor costs were lower in India than in New York, it's just not an apples to apples comparison, even in terms of absolute monetary value, because the wage of a teacher in India is going to be lower than that of a teacher in New York because of the cost of living. But the whole basis of this is even ridiculous before you even get into the difference in cost of labor. But here's another thing to keep in mind, and this is something where Tharoor can call the English racist no matter what they do. Now, Tharoor attacks the English for spending most of the education budget on higher level education and not primary education. And we know this is false, but that's his argument. And I'm moving on to what is true or false and just looking at what his argument is. But what if Thoreau believed, as coincidentally happens to be the case, what if he believed that the English spent more on primary education than on higher level education? What would Thoreau's narrative be then? Well, if that were the case, I think Thoreau would argue that the English were only funding lower primary basic education because they didn't view the Indians as being capable of higher level reasoning, and thus not worth anything beyond a basic education, those racist Englishmen, and that it was more useful to have an Indian population that was basically literate and basically numerate, but they didn't want them to become too educated lest they get uppity or lest they start competing with the English economy itself. That would sort of be Thoreau's spin if Thoreau believed that the English were spending more on primary or basic education than on higher education. See, if the English focus the education funds on higher education, well, that means they're not interested in educating the masses in India, but are more interested in setting up a bureaucratic elite, right? Those racists, they don't care about the Indians, they're just using education of the elite Indians as a way to control the masses. But if they were to focus more on basic education than on higher education, well, then what they're doing is they're depriving Indians of more advanced education because the English are racists who don't think the Indians are either worthy of such education or don't want them to become too educated and too skillful lest they become economically competitive with industrial Britain. And that story is just as viable as Thoreau's story. In fact, Thoreau was able to find who knows how many little anecdotes and how many little quotes about the decline in Indian textile production, right? Even though that literally did not happen, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean Thoreau can't find all sorts of anecdotes saying it happened. And the fact that the Raj spent more on higher than lower education, right, which we know is false, but Thoreau was able to find plenty of anecdotes and plenty of little quotes pointing to this false notion that the Raj spent more on higher than primary education. Right, so this is also sort of an object lesson in how worthless these little trinket anecdotes and these little quotes, right, this bullshit history are at actually getting at the truth.
British Desi American Professor. Jai Hind, and God bless America.